The U.S. is covertly sponsoring Daesh terrorists. That is a claim that Moscow has made when it comes to the Daesh in Afghanistan. But why would the U.S. do that? Russia says the U.S. wants to take revenge on the Taliban for its defeat. In this edition of the Spotlight, we will look at whether our guests agree on this stance by Russia. We'll also take a look at other instances of U.S. support for Daesh terrorists and what gains the U.S. was looking for with this association, which, based on its track record, has not been anything substantial. First, let me introduce our guest for this edition of the Spotlight. Daniel Kabulov, Professor of International Human Rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, joins us from Pittsburgh, PA. Also joining us is Fra Hughes, journalist, author, and activist, who joins us from Belfast. Welcome to you both. Daniel Kabulov, first over to you. So, the U.S. reaching out to armed groups that oppose the Taliban and also secretly giving money to Daesh, that is what Russia's presidential envoy for Afghanistan has said. What do you think?
Well, I mean, why would anybody be surprised by this? The U.S., of course, was the one that supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, beginning actually in mid-1979, before the Soviet Union had a presence there. And, of course, the Mujahideen was a jihadist terrorist group. One of its leaders, of course, was Osama bin Laden, who went on to form al-Qaeda. So the U.S. has been working with terrorist groups, certainly as far back as the 80s. And since then, we know that the U.S. and NATO, partnered with jihadists in Libya to overthrow Gaddafi. They then helped those same jihadists in Libya to travel to Syria to try to overthrow Assad. And the U.S. supported jihadists in Syria against Assad. So this is really par for the course for the United States.
Okay, this is where, Fra Hughes, we need to have you help us, or help the ones who are not a believer of this, or who do not accept this association between the U.S. and terrorist groups, as to how that does happen. Because Daniel Kabulov talked about how it supported jihadists in Libya, then jihadists in Syria. His word was jihadists. We call them terrorists. As to how the U.S. has done this and why it has done this, and why did it resort to the terrorist formula as it saw?
Well, firstly, if you take a look at American history, I mean, America claims to have got its freedom from the British Empire in 1776. And then for 225 years, out of 247 years of American modern history as an independent state, America has been at war with its neighbors or somewhere else within the globe. So not American people, but the American administration and the people behind these wars and the bankers for 225 years have been profiteering from war and profiting from the misery and the death and the maimings that they bring to other sovereign nations. I mean, you could even throw Ukraine into this. I mean, a lot of people believe it's a proxy war. The Americans are going to fight to the last drop of Ukrainian blood in order to destabilize Russia. So if we take that as the most recent example and just move backwards, we can see that America uses proxy armies in order to carry out its dirty work when it's frightened to get its own boots on the ground. Indeed, there were instances in Syria where the Americans supposedly were dropping arms to their allies within Syria, which unfortunately and kind of uncontrollably fell into the path of Daesh. And the Syrian army has claimed before that their positions have been attacked by American forces prior to Daesh ISIS assaults on their positions. So, there is a history of this. There is a history of the proxy wars where the American administration uses other people to carry out their fights. And one other example would be when America and its allies invaded Iraq. It was about 6 months after the invasion of Iraq that we began to witness the bombings of the various mosques. Now, to my mind, that was used by America and especially Britain in order to sow division and civil war within Iraq. While Iraqis were fighting each other, they were not fighting the occupation. And I
Sure.
think America wants to see Afghanistan to continue to be disabled because it's on the borders with Iran, and you never know who they could try and bring to power as a pro-Western puppet regime in the future.
Yeah, we're going to discuss some of those examples in greater detail, and maybe even more examples of this U.S. Association with these terrorists in one form or another. Going back to what the Russian envoy has said, and this is pretty interesting, Daniel Kovalik, he has said the Americans have been acting this way, quote, because they really want to avenge their shameful military political defeat in Afghanistan, and in retaliation they do everything so that peace is not established in this troubled land. Now, I'm curious as to how this can be understood. I mean, it wasn't bad enough that they occupied the land for over 20 years. It wasn't bad enough that nothing that they promised really panned out. But now that they have pulled out and left the country in tatters, they wanted to destroy it more by supporting this group. I mean, are they supporting then by default these terrorists that are bombing instances where we know that it has led to many civilian deaths?
Well, yes, I think that is probably the case. And again, this seems to be the current modus operandi of the United States in its foreign policy, particularly in West Asia. When you look at the wreckage that the U.S. and NATO have left behind in a place like Libya, which was a very stable country under Gaddafi, very prosperous. Of course, the U.S. and NATO bombed that country to smithereens, left it broken. Now there's slaves being sold in public markets. Libya may never be restored to a stable country. The same can be said of Iraq. The same can be said of Afghanistan itself. It seems that actually destruction is the goal many times. And why would that be? I don't think it's purely out of spite, though in the case of Afghanistan, there was probably some of that. But it's because the U.S. has decided that it's easier to rule and to exploit other people's resources and labor if there's no unified, stable state that governs, right? I think another example of this is the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the U.S. has supported proxies as well for many years, which have gone in and killed literally millions of Congolese, but again, to maintain instability in that country so that the West can just, plunder the resources there without limit, without having to pay taxes. I think that's what we're seeing. That is U.S. foreign policy.
In the case of Afghanistan, however, just as a segue here, Fra Hughes, it appears that the U.S. would have a lot to actually benefit when it has an unstable Afghanistan, given the fact that you have this Russian envoy stating what it has in terms of the U.S. terrorist connection, because you have, on the one hand, Iran on the one side, and then you have China, you have also Russia in a sense, where the Russian envoy has actually blamed the U.S. also for wanting to support this because it wants to go after Russia. So the U.S. Can benefit from this association when it comes to three of its, whatever you want to call them, arch foes or what have you. In this case in point, Afghanistan's destabilization through these terrorists can be a way for the U.S. to get to these countries. Is that one or a correct way of looking at this?
I'm not sure. I would say that there's definitely possibilities for further destabilization of Iran, depending on what parts of the country Daesh in Afghanistan could possibly control with the armaments and the finances coming through from America. But I mean, America claimed it attacked Afghanistan because of 9/11, but when they put in their puppet president, Mohammad Karzai, at the very beginning, the first actual kind of presidential decree he signed, I believe, was an order to allow a gas pipeline to travel through Afghanistan. That may have been previously banned or not the case under a previous regime. I agree. I don't think it's about revenge. America cares nothing about Afghanistan or the Afghan people. I believe when they pulled out, they were purely pivoting towards China. So they've withdrawn their forces in Afghanistan in order to regroup both for Ukraine and for any forthcoming kind of action against or to China. So I think that's why they left. I mean, America could have stayed on in Afghanistan. You know, the Taliban had the countryside, but the Allies and the Americans had the cities. So they could have just stayed in perpetuity with a low-level war in order to plunder the resources of Afghanistan.
Hmm.
But I think they have, you know, they have their chess pieces on the global board. And if we look even further back, you know, when America was focused on Latin America, we had dictators and people that were supported brutal dictatorships, brutal right-wing fascist regimes that tortured and murdered and disappeared their own citizens. That was all with the backing of America. So America, as it changes its foreign policy, following its, you know, its eye on where it's looking to exploit next, then that's why we have seen the war in Ukraine, the wars in West Asia, and potential wars going forward with a potential proxy with Taiwan and Japan against China. So it's a very dangerous, very sinister campaign that the American administration is following.
Yeah, and Danny Kovalik, when we first started out, you talked about the statements made by the former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in terms of the Mujahideen. I think is what you said. And interestingly, in some sense, back in 2014, the former U.S. President Barack Obama hosted a two-day strategy meeting. I'm looking at this one particular case in point, where he met with the intelligence chiefs of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, Jordan, and some other Middle Eastern countries. And what the purpose of that meeting was, this two-day security meeting, was to refocus military aid away from the al-Nusra Front and, well, they call it ISIS, we call them Daesh, towards more moderate groups of what they called rebels. So when you take a look at the type of involvement with these terrorist groups through its allies, okay, we're seeing an extensive, I guess, penetration that they had. Not penetration, connection that they had with these groups in a variety of levels and based on a variety of different terrorist groups. And of course, that was 9 years ago, back in 2014. These types of relationships have been going on for quite some time, right?
Well, yeah, and I believe it was in 2014 that Joseph Biden, then vice president, said that there were no moderate rebels in Syria, and that therefore the rebels we were supporting were not moderate, meaning they were in fact the very terrorists we claimed we were fighting against. In fact, that could be said about the Free Syrian Army, which the U.S. openly supported for a time, and which committed terrorist acts in Syria, including trying to destroy Christian churches in cities like Malula and Homs and elsewhere. So yeah, I mean, we know for sure that the support for those types of groups goes back that far and even farther. You know, Seymour Hersh, who won the Pulitzer Prize, a great Western journalist, he wrote an article back in, I want to say 2007 maybe, saying that even by like 2005, George W. Bush had pivoted away from fighting terrorism to actually at times partnering with terrorists to try to weaken Syria, weaken Iran. And let's remember, the U.S. Has supported the MEK over time, the MEK being a terrorist group that's killed tens of thousands of Iranian civilians. So again, nothing is surprising about this. This is par for the course. The sad part is that few Americans realize it, but the truth is out there. And again, there's many officials in the U.S. government who at times have admitted this.
The sad part, I think, sadder even than that, is the fact that we here in the Islamic Republic are being labeled as terrorists. Not we, but the government. That's a whole other topic for another Spotlight program. Okay, so the U.S., Frahus, has a base in Syria. Not far from it, there are terrorists that are there. And for years now, even though it's illegally occupying that part of Syrian territory, it's been saying that is there to eradicate terrorists. Why doesn't it get rid of the terrorists there? Why is it that, for example, Russia has said that the Al-Tanf military base, terrorists are roaming freely around in that area, and also has accused the U.S. of training some of these terrorists? What do you think of those statements from Russia?
Firstly, I'd have to say I've always been very impressed by the spokespeople that the Russian government has fronting their foreign policy. They seem to be people of integrity, people of honor, and people of honesty, and who refreshingly appear to tell the truth and paint the picture as it's seen on the ground in Syria and Ukraine and Afghanistan and anywhere they choose to see what's happening under kind of Western imperialism. I believe fully that America will be training the Daesh terrorists in Syria. They're still there stealing the wheat of the Syrian people. They're still there stealing the oil. So we're back to the wars for profit that continually seems to be the background to these conflicts. I would fully believe that America is not only training and arming and financing Daesh in Syria, but I would be fairly convinced that they are directing them. The only ointment in the eye here at the moment appears to be Turkey's growing fraternal relationship with Syria and Russia, and it's distancing itself from America, and perhaps it's going to join the new kind of Belt and Road initiative, the new Silk Road, to bring more prosperity and more jobs to Turkey. So I believe the Russians, and I would believe them a lot sooner than I would ever believe one word of a British, European, or American politician or spokesperson.
Let's go back to the year 2012. I know it's a long time ago, Daniel Kowalik, but I'm wondering if you remember this. This was a case that went to trial in London of a Swedish man that was accused of terrorism in Syria. Again, I don't know if you recall that. And you have this man being tried in court, and then all of a sudden, it's not all of a sudden, but then it became clear that the courts were not aware that British intelligence had actually been arming the terrorists that that defendant was charged with. I don't know if you remember that. It was quite a case where later on, based on a particular source, reports were cited that MI6 had cooperated with the CIA on a rat line, as it was called, of arms transfers from Libyan stockpiles to the Syrian terrorists. So that's a clear case in point of how you have different intels of the countries, in this case the US and the UK, cooperating together to arm terrorists. I know this is, again, old news, but don't you think this serves as a clear case in point of US and, of course, the UK support behind terrorists?
Well, yes, and I don't remember that particular case, but what I do remember is, again, another Seymour Hersh article called Red Lines and Rat Lines about the very phenomenon you were talking about the UK and the US supporting terrorists in Syria. And by the way, Seymour Hersh really, after writing that, had a hard time getting published anywhere because no one in the West wanted to hear the truth about that. The other thing in 2012 was that the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, I believe, they had a classified document that somehow was leaked that, again, admitted that the U.S. was supporting groups in Syria whose intentions were to set up a caliphate in Syria. And so, again, all these things are pretty evident that the U.S. has been secretly supporting these groups for many years.
The question that comes to mind here, it's a very simple question, Frau Hughes, and forgive me if I'm asking this, but why does the U.S. have to subscribe to terrorists? Why doesn't it just go after who it wants to go after, which it does, through its own army? Is it that incapable that it has to subscribe to terrorists?
I think it's possibly cheaper to use someone else. If you remember the Vietnam War with so many American casualties that the American people eventually turned against the administration and demanded that their troops be brought home. That hasn't happened in recent conflicts because we saw shock and awe What you've actually seen is the America as the #1 superpower, having such a tactical advantage on the rest of the world. I mean, attacking Afghanistan and attacking Iraq and Libya and Syria. These are countries that could not possibly militarily stand up to America. But I do believe it's easier to try and install a proxy government. It's easier to pay other people to do the dirty work and do the fighting. And rather than put a huge amount of American boots on the ground and therefore kind of exposing them to potential attack by a revolutionary army of national liberation. I mean, when you create Daesh, I believe America created that with Saudi Arabia. So it was, Saudi, Takfiri, fanatical, kind of fundamentalist Islamists who are following the wrong path in Islam by following the route of terrorism. I mean, they were financed by Saudi Arabia and they were backed by America, and Turkey allowed them to enter into Syria. So there's a little triumvirate there that allowed this war on Syria to take place. So it's easy for the American Congress to vote, to give money to the military budget, and then the black hole that appears in the CIA accountability of those finances and the Pentagon and stuff, that they can just run off, buy arms, buy weapons, buy mercenaries, because that's what Daesh is. It's a mercenary army paid for by America and Saudi Arabia. And when you think of the likes of the White Helmets, they were the kind of propaganda wing for Daesh in Syria. I mean, they were started by an ex-MI6 operative, and they were backed by millions of dollars from Britain and from Canada and from America in order to promote the propaganda that they were using around chemical warfare and the barrel bombs that were just supposed to destroy hospitals in Syria. So, if I had the money, I wouldn't go and fight my enemy. I'd probably pay someone else to do it to keep myself safe.
Okay, so the final question goes to you, Daniel Kowalik. Iran has always said that when you have the foreign countries and their armies in one form or another in this particular region of West Asia, and this is in direct reference to the U.S., that you're going to have these types of activities still prosper in some sense, or still to continue, that is. And of course, the association that we have made in this program of the U.S. with the Daesh terrorists is still one source of instability, which Iran says that the U.S. needs to go. Are we looking at the fact that if the U.S. was to leave the region, that these terrorists would cease to exist?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the sad truth is that once you create such monsters, they tend to have a life of their own. We saw that again with the Mujahideen, which morphed into Al Qaeda, which then went on to attack the United States. I don't think that was the plan. I mean, there's a lot of unintended consequences from all this. Now, you'd hope that eventually those things would fizzle out. But again, the U.S. has created monsters that it's set loose on the world. And once that happens, it may be hard to control and stop them. And that is one of the great tragedies of all this.
Thank you very much for that. Daniel Kowalik, Professor of International Human Rights, University of Pittsburgh School of Law from Pittsburgh, PA. Farah Hughes, thank you. Journalist, author, and activist from Belfast. With that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From Mikhail Vitagwe and the team, it's goodbye.